evening, good vach, shavua tov. Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night and starting the week as best we can with a beautiful daf. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Shandora in the Bronx says, Shavua Tov, may you, Nina, and all our brothers and sisters be safe in these times. Amen. Melissa in Great Neck, New York. Ella's in the house. Hi, I'm in Florida. Marjorie in Georgia. I'd like to say a quick prayer for may God comfort the bereaved, the family of this person. I don't have any information, but the person who was killed in the assassination attempt on former President Trump, and somebody else who was seriously injured. Trump himself was injured. Whatever your politics are, this is not the way we want politics to move forward in America. And so we're praying for the safety of all involved and the comfort of the bereaved. Okay, we are we're right at the top of page 19, page Yud Tes, here in Tractate Bava Basra, 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 2, and we've been talking about if you have a pit, or you have a laundry pit, or you have hazardous materials like urine, or the kind of stuff that heats up, when it is stacked in one place. Or we're talking about roots or liquids that could seep out, anything that you're doing on your property that could have a deleterious effect on your neighbor's property. So the general setback from the property line, it's pretty modest. We're talking about 3 handbreadths away from the property line. But sometimes it's more, sometimes it's 4 or 5 cubits, sometimes 25 cubits, depending on what we're talking about. And this is the general topic. Okay, we picked this up right at the top of page 19a. The Mishnah taught, nor may one set up a launderer's pond near the neighbor's wall, unless he distances it 3 handbreadths from the wall. Rav Nachman says that Rabbi Bar Abba says they taught this only with regard to a soaking pond in which soiled clothes are left to soak for several days. But in the case of a washing pond where clothes are actively cleaned, 4 cubits are required. And that opinion is also taught in a baraisa. A launderer's pond must be kept 4 cubits from one's neighbor's wall. But didn't we learn in the Mishnah that one must keep a distance of only 3 handbreadths? Rather, must one not conclude from the Baraisa that the statement of Rav Nachman is correct? It's a lovely little insight into daily life in the world of 2,000 years ago. They didn't have washing machines, right, with agitators inside. So you had different methods of washing different kinds of clothes in different condition. But right here, very interesting, right? So there's one kind of washing system, shall we say, where there's a pond and you let the clothes soak for several days. And that's more passive. And then you have a more active sort of washing station. I wouldn't be surprised if they had some kind of, ribbed board like we've seen. Or maybe that's more modern technology from only, 2 or 3 centuries ago. But at any rate, active washing, and that you need a bigger setback from the property line. Presumably you have splashing, you have detergent, whatever it is that they're using as the... I don't have a word for it, but the soap, whatever the soap is, whatever the agent is that they're using to remove the stains from the clothes, will present more of a hazard to the neighbor. And some raise this as a contradiction and present the Mishnah and Baraisa as apparently conflicting sources. So we learned, right? So this discrepancy between, is the launderer's pond meant to be 4 cubits or 3 handbreadths from the property line? We learned in the Mishna that the launderer's pond must be kept 3 handbreadths from his neighbor's property, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa that 4 cubits are required? And Rav Nachman says that Rabbi Bar Ava says this is not difficult, la kasha. Here the Mishnah is referring to a soaking pond, which requires 3 handbreadths. There the Baraisa is referring to a washing pond, in which case 4 cubits are necessary. Rav Chia, the son of Rav Avia, teaches that the Mishnah explicitly as reading, unless he distanced 3 handbreadths from the rim of the soaking pond and the wall. Right, and when we talk about a wall, so we've already had the question yesterday, what do we mean by a wall? Are we saying like an actual wall, right, that's a fence, some kind of a fence or actual stone wall between the properties? Or are we saying the wall of the pit, right? So we haven't fully answered that yet either. Now the Mishnah teaches that one who digs a pit must distance it 3 handbreadths from another person's property, from his neighbor's property, and plaster it with lime. That's going to seal the contents into that pit. And a dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the precise wording of the Mishnah? Did we learn and plasters with lime, meaning that the walls must be plastered with lime in addition to distancing the pit 3 handbreadths? Or perhaps did we learn that it's a choice? Either it's 3 handbreadths or the wall of the pit is plastered with lime. And the Gemara answers, it is obvious that we learned and plasters with lime, meaning and. You need both, and the distance and the lime. As if it enters your mind that we learned or plasters with lime, one or the other, which is the same as what is stated in the clause of the Mishnah discussing olive refuse, right? That olive refuse, after the oil has been pressed out of the olives, this kind of refuse can actually start to become hot and even combust. So in that Mishnah discussing olive refuse, if so, let the Tana combine them and teach them together. If the same halacha applied in all circumstances, all of the Mishnah's cases could be taught together. The fact that they were split out is giving us a clue. So the Gemara answers, this is not a proof, as perhaps these cases are taught separately because this type of damage is not similar to that type of damage. In other words, there are different hazardous substances that can cause damage to your neighbor, but it's a different kind of damage that they cause. And so even though we might have the same requirement of 3 handbreadths from the property line and plastering the pit with lime, still they might be listed separately. Now the first clause of the Mishnah addresses the issue of damage due to moisture, whereas the last clause addresses the issue of damage due to heat. And now the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to rock that is so soft it crumbles in one's hands, this one digs his pit from here on his property, and that one digs his pit from there. This one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime, and that one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime. And the Gemara analyzes this ruling. So the specific reason that one must also plaster with lime is that he is using rock that crumbles in his hands. In other words, the walls of your pit are going to be quite porous, and whatever is contained in your pit could easily seep out, and so you need additional protective measures. Plastering the side of the pit with lime and the 3 handbreadths. And it sounds like both people on both sides of the property line need 3 handbreadths from the property line. In other words, there's going to be 6 handbreadths from pit to pit is the closest they could be, since each one needs 3 handbreadths from the property line. And the Gemara answers, one could say that the same is true, i.e. that even though he is using rock that does not crumble in one's hands, he must still plaster with lime. And it was necessary for the Tana to mention the case of rock that crumbles in one's hands, as it might enter your mind to say that since it crumbles in one's hands, let us require a greater distance. Therefore, the Tana teaches us that this is not the case. The Mishnah teaches that one must distance the solid residue of produce that has been pressed, free of its oil, and animal manure, and salt, and lime, and rocks, 3 handbreadths from the wall of another, or plaster its receptacle with lime. So the Gemara comments, we learned in a Mishnah there on Shabbos, Tractate Shabbos 47b, with what substances may one insulate a pot of cooked food on Erev Shabbos, right, on Friday afternoon, and with what substances may one not insulate it? So the issue here is you can't keep cooking, right? You can't keep cooking on Shabbos. Now, we do in the sense of cholent, because the food was already cooked, right? The meat in the cholent was already cooked on Friday. And what you're doing is you're just allowing it to stay warm, not continue cooking during Shabbos, but you cannot add heat. You can't turn up the heat. So when they're talking about that there are substances that you could use to insulate the pot that has your Shabbos food in it, insulate is okay. But if you're going to bring in materials that themselves will combust, that themselves will generate heat, then that would be a problem. And so that's why these materials that generate heat are not permitted for insulating the pot on Shabbos. Why are we learning that right now? Because we're talking about if these substances are in your pit, in your backyard, near your neighbor's property line, you're going to need a bigger setback from the property line. So we learned in that tractate that with what substances may one insulate and with one may we not insulate. One may insulate the pot neither with the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil, because this is ripe to create heat, nor with manure, nor with salt, nor with lime, nor with sand, whether those materials are moist or whether they are dry. Why? Because all of these materials spontaneously generate heat when piled up for an extended period of time. Now that really, sand generates heat? I think they're talking about some kind of particular type of sand that was available there. Or maybe it's outdoors and reflecting from the sun. I'm not sure, but whatever kind of sand they're talking about, that's the issue. Therefore, they add heat to the pot that they insulate. And the Gemara asks, right, so it's more, they're doing more than insulate. They're cooking, they're adding heat. So what is different there? What is different here that the Mishnah teaches the law in the case of rocks, and it does not teach the halacha in the case of sand? And what is different there that it teaches the law in the case of sand, and it does not teach the law in the case of rocks, right? So why are these substances not in both lists if the issue is generating heat? Rav Yosef says there is a practical reason for this difference. Rocks are not mentioned there because it's not customary for people to insulate food with rocks. And Abaye said to him, and is it customary for people to insulate food with wool fleece and tabs of purple wool? And it is taught in a baraisa, one may insulate food with wool fleece, with combed wool clumps, which are unwoven, with tabs of purple wool and with swatches of soft material. But one may not move them on Shabbos because they are muktzah. These are things that are normally associated with the kind of work that is done during the week, and therefore they're set aside, muktzah. We don't even touch them on Shabbos. But they could be used, interestingly enough, to insulate a pot, since you're setting that up before Shabbos, right? So that's when you touched it, but then you may no longer touch those materials on Shabbos. So rather, Abaye said that the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnah, follows the biblical aphorism in the verse that states, quote, its neighbor tells about him. This is from Job. We were talking a lot about Job at the end of chapter 1. Here we're just taking a quote from Job because it becomes an aphorism for a different kind of idea, i.e. that one example is mentioned and the same applies to the other case. So he taught the law in the case of rocks here, and the same is true of sand. And he taught the law in the case of sand there, and the same is true of rocks. It didn't need to be spelled out. So Rava said to Abaye, if this is correct, that its neighbor tells about him, well then let him teach the halacha of all these examples in just one case, and let him teach the halacha of just one in the other case. And it can be said that the same is true with regard to all the others. You could have just given one example, and anything like, manure or the residue of olives that have had their oil pressed out of them, which heats up, can't be used for insulation and requires that extra setback from the property line. So rather, Rava said this is the reason that the Tana of the Mishnah does not teach the law in the case of rocks, because they break, i.e. they scratch the pot. And consequently, people do not use them for insulating food at all. So here, this is the reason that the Tana does not teach the halakha in the case of sand, because it heats hot items and cools cold items, and therefore it does not cause any damage to the wall. And the Gemara asks, but Rabbi Shaya taught in a baraisa that one must distance sand from his neighbor's wall. And the Gemara answers there, it is referring to damp sand, which must be kept at a distance due to its moisture. And the Gemara challenges, let the Tana of our Mishnah also teach the law in the case of sand, and we will interpret it as referring to damp sand. The Gemara answers, this Tana already taught the case of a water channel, which is a source of dampness, and therefore there was no need to mention damp sand as well. Gemara rejects this answer. That is correct. The Gemara rejects this answer. That is incorrect. Is that to say that the Mishnah includes only one example of a source of dampness? Does the Mishnah teach the case of a water channel, and yet it also teaches, doesn't the Mishnah teach the case of a water channel, and yet it also teaches the example of a launderer's pond, which is obviously moist? And this demonstrates that the Mishnah teaches many cases despite the similarity between them, and therefore it should have mentioned the law in the case of sand as well. And the Gemara answers, both of these particular examples are necessary. As had the Tana only taught the case of a water channel, one would have claimed that a distance must be kept because it is fixed, i.e. water constantly passes through it. But with regard to a launderer's pond, which is not fixed, as sometimes it holds water and sometimes not, one might say that one need not distance it from his neighbor's property. And conversely, had the Tana taught only the case of a launderer's pond, one might have said that this must be distanced because its water is fixed and standing in one location, and therefore it leaks out. With regard to a water channel, one might say distancing is not required. Consequently, it is necessary to state both examples. By contrast, including the law in the case of sand would not add any novel understanding. That's why it was left out, but we are to understand that sand is included in those items. The Mishnah teaches one must distance seeds. What does it mean to distance seeds? Does that mean I have a pile of sunflower seeds? I have to store them at more than 3 handbreadths from the property line? What they're talking about is planting. You're not going to plant your garden or your field right up to the property line. You need to leave a little bit of space. I.e., one may not plant seeds, and one may not operate the plow, and one must eliminate urine 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. You don't plant right up to the edge of your property. And the Gemara asks, why is it necessary to mention seeds? Let him derive the requirement to distance the seeds due to the requirement to distance a plow. Once you've said you can't bring your plow closer than 3 handbreadths to the property line, to the wall of your neighbor, why do you also have to mention the seeds? Isn't it obvious that if the plow can't go there, the seeds aren't going to make it, since the plow makes the furrow for the seeds? And the Gemara answers, this is referring to planting with a single hand motion, which is performed without plowing. I guess there's some seeds that you just throw on top, I guess like grass, right? And the Gemara further challenges the Mishnah teaches that one must distance a plow. Well, why can't we derive this from the requirement to, can we not derive the requirement to distance the plow from the requirement to distance the seeds, as plowing is preparation for planting? And the Gemara answers, this is referring to one who plows to prepare the ground for trees. The Gemara challenges, but if so, let him derive this requirement to distance a plow due to the requirement to distance the water. If there are trees, there must be a water channel to irrigate them. And arranging one's field in such a manner should be prohibited for that reason. The Gemara answers, the Tana of the Mishnah is referring to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, concerning which it is written, and drinks water as the rain of heaven comes down. That's Deuteronomy 11:11. Meaning that in Eretz Yisrael, water channels were not needed to irrigate the orchard of trees. Now the Gemara asks, is this to say, now we're on page 19b, that seeds take root to the sides, i.e. the growing roots spread sideways and cause damage to walls? Is that why we can't bring the seeds so close to the wall? Because their roots will extend outward into the neighbor's property? And this is going to contradict a teaching that we've seen elsewhere where roots tend to go down. But didn't we learn in a Mishnah with regard to one who bends a branch of a grapevine into the ground so that it strikes roots and produces a new vine? If it does not have 3 handbreadths of earth over it, he may not plant the seed above it, as he would thereby transgress the prohibition of diverse kinds. Now, what we're talking about is a procedure like in this picture, right? Where you're taking a vine, you're taking a branch, you're bending it down into the earth where it takes root and sort of sends up what's going to become a new vine or a new tree further away. Now, when that is it a Mishna? When that Mishna is being taught in Tractate Kilayim, what they're discussing there is how far away you have to be, how far beneath the earth that bent tree branch that you're moving under the earth so it'll take root. How far under the ground does it have to be so that you could plant grain, for example, above that ground? Right? In other words, maybe you have a vine and a vineyard here, and you have a very long vine. You're going to go under the ground and extend it and have it come out over there, like 20 feet away. So this 20 feet, could I plant some grain there, or will it violate mixed species, growing varied species together, which is prohibited by the Torah? You can't have grain growing in your vineyard. Well, if that vine is more than 3 handbreadths under the ground, you could plant the grain there. If it was more shallow than that, where you're doing this runner, you cannot plant the grain there. That's just incidental to why this Mishnah is being brought here, because what we're challenging is, generally speaking, do roots grow outward or do they grow down? That's going to have relevance in our discussion of what's going on near the property line. And it is taught with regard to this Mishnah, but one may plant on either side of that bent branch. And this indicates that there is no concern that the roots of the seeds will spread out sideways. So Rabbi Chaga says in the name of Rabbi Yosef, the issue here is not that the roots will spread out sideways and reach the wall. Rather, it is prohibited to plant seeds near one's neighbor's property because they break up the ground and cause loose soil to rise up, which damages the foundation of the wall. So here we're talking about the neighbor's wall, or possibly the wall of his pit, but at any rate, it causes some instability at the property line. New subject. The Mishnah teaches, and urine must be kept at a distance of 3 handbreadths from the wall of one's neighbor. So Rabbah Bar Chana says it is permitted for a person to urinate alongside the wall of another, as it is written. Quote, it's very interesting. It's from 1 Kings 21:21, talking about the wicked king Ahab, who practiced idolatry, was very influenced by Queen Jezebel. They killed prophets of Hashem and promoted idolatry. Very, very wicked king. And eventually, they were punished. Now, it says, I guess the prophet is saying, and I will cut off from Ahab those who urinate against the wall, and him that is shut up, and him that is left at large in Israel. Now, what's talking about here is that the followers of Ahab, who followed him into idolatry and all the evil that caused in the kingdom of Israel, they are going to be cut off. And who are we talking about? Those who urinate against a wall. Who's that? Men. That's what they're talking about. Those who urinate against a wall, this is an aphorism for men, because women don't do that. Okay? As the verse employs the term those who urinate against the wall to mean males, it seems that urinating against a wall was a common practice even then. So the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that urine must be kept a distance of 3 handbreadths from the wall? And the Gemara answers there, the Mishnah is referring to urine that is poured from a chamber pot, as opposed to urine that is passed from the body. And the Gemara suggests, coming here, Baraisa, a person may not pour water at the side of the wall of of his neighbor, unless he distances the water 3 handbreadths from it. If pouring water is prohibited, Kal v'chomer, how much more so should urination be prohibited? And the Gemara explains there too, it is referring to urine that is poured from a chamber pot, right? So the question being asked is, if you have a backyard and at the edge of your backyard is the wall of your neighbor's property and you wanted to pee outside, okay, that sounds like, why would I do that? I could use my bathroom inside because we're so privileged to live in the 21st century. But back then they didn't have plumbing, they didn't have indoor plumbing. It was pretty common to maybe go out in the backyard and relieve yourself if you had the privacy to do that. So could you just do it against the wall? And one view is, yeah, you could just pee against the wall. What you can't do is empty the chamber pot from inside. That maybe is like a bunch of pee that's been sitting in that pot, and just throw that against the wall, because that could cause quite a bit more damage. Gemara suggests, come in here, another proof from a Baraisa, a person may not urinate alongside the wall of another unless he distances himself 3 handbreadths from it. In what case is this statement said? It is said in the case of a brick wall. But in the case of a stone wall, one must distance himself enough so that it does not cause damage. And how far is that? 1 handbreadth. And if there is hard rock present, it is permitted to urinate there. And the Gemara comments, the refutation of the opinion of Rabba bar Chama is a conclusive refutation, and his ruling is rejected. So bottom line, if you go out in your backyard, if your neighbor's wall is made out of bricks, so you want to pee back there, you have to let it fall on the ground at least 3 handbreadths from the wall. If the wall is made out of stone, you could let the pee fall on the ground 1 handbreadth from the wall. But if your backyard is made out of stone, right, so stone wall, stone ground, then you can pee on the wall all you want, because it's not going to your neighbor's property. It's just going to stay in your, cement or stone patio. Hopefully you could find a better place to relieve yourself than, where it's going to create standing urine in your stone-floored backyard. Rabbi Tovi Bar Kisna says that Shmuel says a wafer does not reduce the dimensions of a window. What are we talking about here? Here's a good explanation from Rav Steinsaltz. When a corpse or a significant part of a corpse is in one room of a house, its impurity can spread to a room adjacent to it if there is a window of a certain size between the rooms, right? So we know corpse tuma, right, and a tent over a corpse tuma, right? So if you touch a dead body, right, we just read this Shabbos in Shul, Torah portion Chukat, or Chukas, which is the law of the red heifer, the waters of sprinkling, that if a person comes into contact with a dead body, he has to be sprinkled with the waters that contain the ashes of the red heifer before he could enter the holy temple when the temple is standing. You would also have corpse tuma if you walked over a grave, and you would also have corpse tuma if you were in a room with a corpse under the same roof, even if you didn't touch it. So what does it mean to be in a room? What if the corpse is in that room and I'm in this room? Well, then I'm not under the same ceiling with that corpse, so I don't become tameh. I don't become ritually impure. But if there's an open window between that room where the corpse is and my room where I'm standing, then it's like that ritual impurity spreads out, and it's like the 2 rooms are linked if that window is of a sufficient size. Well, what if that window is just the minimum size? Such that if it was a little bit, it's the exact minimum size. So if it was any smaller, then that ritual impurity would not spread into this room. But it's just big enough that purity does come in. So can I make that window a little smaller? Yeah, I could. So in other words, if I put a 2x4 right in the bottom of that windowsill, now I've made that window effectively smaller, and I don't become tameh because the window is now too small for the impurity to pass through, as it were. Again, we're not talking about diseases or bacteria. We're talking about ritual impurity. But there was a minimum measure of that window for the impurity to pass through. So if we block off part of that window, now it's too small and the impurity does not pass through. Okay, what substances count as blocking off part of the window and what substances don't? Food does not block off the window, but trash might. So let's keep reading. A wafer does not reduce the dimensions of the window. Shmuel states that when one puts a wafer in a window, and a wafer is like a cracker, that's what we're talking about, some kind of like pressed bread, the wafer is not considered an obstruction. So the size of the opening, as relevant to this law, remains the same. The impurity just passes right through the wafer. And the Gemara asks, why discuss specifically this case? Why does Shmuel teach this law with regard to a wafer? Even a thick chunk of bread also does not reduce the dimensions of a window, even though it's much thicker. Again, it's food, and the impurity just passes through it. The Gemara answers, Shmuel is speaking, utilizing the style of it is not necessary, like this. It is not necessary to state this law with regard to a thick slice of bread, since it is fit for him to consume. He does not nullify it, i.e., he does not plan to leave it in the window for an extended amount of time. But in the case of a wafer, which becomes disgusting when placed in a window, I might have thought that he does nullify it and it becomes part of the house, thereby reducing the size of the window. To counter this, Shmuel teaches us that even a wafer is not nullified, as it can be used to feed animals, as one is not particular about their food. Therefore, the wafer does not become part of the window in which it is placed, and the impurity, it doesn't become part of the structure, and therefore the impurity passes through it. The Gemara challenges this, and let him derive this law from the fact that the wafer is an item that is susceptible to tuma, to ritual impurity, and any item that is susceptible to impurity does not serve as a barrier against the spread of impurity. And the Gemara explains this is referring to a wafer that was kneaded in fruit juice, Kneaded, kneaded in fruit juice, which is not one of the liquids that renders food susceptible to ritual impurity. And therefore, the wafer itself is not susceptible to tuma. It cannot become tameh. Consequently, one might have thought that it serves as a barrier before ritual impurity and reduces the dimensions of the window. But because it's not nullified in the sense that he might pick it up and feed it to a dog, it doesn't become part of the structure of the house, and therefore it does not block the impurity from moving from one room to another. The Gemara raises an objection to Shmuel's opinion from a Mishna, Tractate Ochalos 6.2, with regard to a basket that is full of straw or an earthenware barrel full of dried figs, which are placed in a window. One considers if the straw or the dried figs would stand on their own with the basket or the barrel removed, then they would serve as a barrier against the spread of impurity. But if they would not stand on their own, then they would not serve as a barrier. Now the Gemara explains the objection. But why should the straw or the dried figs serve as a barrier? Even straw that can stand on its own is fit for feeding to one's animal and will likely be removed from the opening, which means it should not be considered part of the window. And the Gemara answers the ruling of the Mishna stated with regard to rotted straw, which is not fit for animal consumption. The Gemara asks, but is it fit for use? But it is fit for use in making clay for bricks. And the Gemara answers, this is referring to straw that has thorns in it, and therefore it is not fit for making bricks. Even so, says the Gemara, it is fit for kindling a fire. So you're not planning on leaving it there. You're likely to remove it later. The Gemara answers that this is referring to wet straw. Gemara responds, nevertheless, it is fit for kindling a large fire. If one builds a large fire, wet straw will dry and become ignitable. And the Gemara answers, a large fire is not common, and therefore, in all likelihood, the straw will remain in the window. The Gemara further asks, but dried figs are fit for him to consume, and he will certainly remove them. Consequently, they should not be considered fixed in their place. Shmuel says this is referring to a case where the figs become worm-infested, and so Rabba bar Avu teaches this is referring to a case where the figs became worm-infested, so they are likely to remain there and become part of the house and shrink the window, and therefore we can say that they do block the spread of tuma. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara clarifies, what are the exact circumstances of this barrel that held the dried figs? If this is referring to a case where its opening faced outward, i.e. not toward the source of the tuma, the corpse in the next room. Now on page 20a, let the barrel itself serve as a barrier. It should not be susceptible to impurity in this case, as an earthenware vessel does not contract impurity if its exterior is exposed to impurity. Rather, one must say that its opening faces inward, and it rendered impure because the impurity enters through its opening. And if you wish, say instead that actually its opening faces outward, and with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a metal barrel which does contract impurity through its exterior. We're going to stop there. I'm going to take some questions. With God's help, we will be together tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. I am traveling. I should be in my dad's house in Florida tomorrow, and hopefully I will be able to teach the class as scheduled. And then a reminder that Monday and Wednesday of this coming week, there will not be class, but hopefully there will be on Tuesday. I'm not totally clear. I mean, it's funny. We've been talking about barriers and how close you can come to a barrier. And here we're talking about, whether adding this kind of material, straw or pressed figs or a wafer, creates a barrier to tuma flowing, from one room to another in a house because there's a corpse in one room. How does this relate to the setback at the property line for, a launderer's pond or urine or lime or salt or sand? I'm a little bit unclear on that, but I hope, and my prayers, it will become clearer tomorrow what the connection is. Okay, on Bava Basra 19. Joe, some trees have taproots that go straight down while others spread out. And they would have to know which type was which when planting. That's an excellent point. I have definitely observed, that some kinds of trees, right, what kind of moisture are they getting? They're getting moisture from the rain that's coming down or from, the irrigation that people put on their lawns. And so their roots just definitely spread outward. But there are other types of trees, I guess this is called a taproot, where there's some kind of a water table down below the ground. Maybe it's, 5 feet down, 10 feet down, 15 feet down, and the roots are heading toward that water source. And I wonder, Joe is saying that it depends on the type of tree, whether its roots will spread out or whether they'll go down. I almost wonder, can the same tree send out different kinds of roots depending on what the source of water is? But at any rate, in terms of what damage will be caused and what the setback should be from the property line, are we in a situation where the roots will go down, or are we in a situation where the roots will spread out? And that should definitely affect what the setback is so that you don't damage your neighbor's property. Joe also says leaving an easement next to a wall makes sense to access the field without damaging the crop. It also provides a space for the gleaner to gather the corners of the crops after the harvest, particularly right when we're talking about leaving for the poor to come. Right? If we're talking about a field that they had to leave the corners, the payas, and they had to leave what falls as they're harvesting. Those are left for the poor, and the poor need to have access to the field in order to get that share. That's what I've got for us tonight. I look forward, God willing, to learning with you tomorrow, Sunday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. God willing, everything will go according to schedule in my travels. If not, I'll put an announcement on the Facebook page, Accidental Talmudist. Have a good night. Shavua Tov. Good Vach.